welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm honoured today to be joined by Benjamin Perks. Benjamin Perks is the head of campaigns and advocacy in the Division of Global Communications and Advocacy at the United Nations Children's Fund, based in New York. He leads public and policy advocacy on the development and protection of children. He is lead UN coordinator for International Day of Play and for the 2026 UNICEF WHO Global Caregiver Forum. He previously served in human rights diplomacy roles as the UNICEF representative and UN resident coordinator to both the Republic of North Macedonia and the Republic of Montenegro. In both capacities, he advocated for reforms to fulfill international human rights commitments and realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. He has served in Georgia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, India, and Albania. And he led the Back to School campaign in the northern Afghanistan, which brought 3 million children, including 1 million girls, into school, most of them for the first time in their lives. He has led work on demobilization of child soldiers, deinstitutionalization of children in state care, addressing child poverty, preschool expansion, and disability inclusion. Ben is Senior Fellow at the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which researches education policy on character, social and emotional development of children, and an Associate Faculty Member at Oxford University, Development of Social Policy and Innovation. He is recognised as a public speaker and campaigner on child development and protection, and his book, Trauma Proof, Healing, Attachment and the Science of Prevention, came out in 2025, which he has done a TEDx talk on adverse child experiences for. What a wonderful conversation, but welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much, and what an amazing introduction. And just to say that I'm really delighted to be on your podcast. I am speaking in a personal capacity today. I'm not speaking on behalf of the UN or my workplace, but I'm just really excited to be here and talking to you across the Atlantic about these very important issues.
Yeah, that's cool. It's lovely to connect, and just reading that through again, just honouring your work. It's beautiful work, and I went straight to connect with those kids. Northern Afghanistan, that first time into school and bringing people into community, so beautiful. And I'd just like to start the podcast with, how we connected, and realised it was via the wonderful Dr. Warren Larkin. So I believe you did a podcast with him.
Yeah, and a webinar. Fantastic guy. I've known him for several years. Really an incredible champion for child protection and child development. Just great, and for addressing adverse child experiences. Great colleague and friend.
Yeah, lovely guy. And we worked with him on the Seen and Heard Schools project with Warren. So well, we brought together and the book, Trauma Proof, Healing, Attachment and the Science of Prevention. We're going to get into that today because it's a fantastic piece of work. But before we get there, I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of where you came from, what brought you through, and the start at the beginning. So how were early years for you? What was your life like?
I write in the book that I don't have really deep memories of my early childhood. I spent the first half of my childhood in a dysfunctional family situation, and the second half in state care in 2 children's homes. I ran away from the children's homes. They were violent, and I was I ran and lived on the streets as an adolescent intermittently. And then I left care at 16 and became an activist somehow for the rights of young people in care. One of the things that was really important on my journey was I was in a really dark place when I was 14, 15. I had a best friend killed in a knife, a gang fight. I'd grown up very much without a sense of love or safety. And a teacher came into my life, and I talk about her a lot in the book, Jan. And she was really the first person that I had a conversation with, and the first person that, a proper conversation where you feel really heard and seen. And she just convinced me that I mattered as an individual, something that I'd never really thought about before, and that I could do amazing things in my life. And so she gave me, I guess, to some extent, the courage and strength to try and do GCSEs. And I found myself at 16 as an activist in London, what was then the National Association of Young People in Care, campaigning for the rights of children in the care system. So I became a campaigner on the back of having had really strong lived experience very, very young. Yeah, that's a summary of, I guess, my earliest years.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Ben. I mean, it's very sad to hear that was the journey you had, and how dysfunctional it was at home, how violent and difficult it was in the care home, and very sad to hear about your friend. Really, really touches me, and sadly, in our work team, we heard a lot of people lost young friends along the way, particularly in teens, suicide or violence or drugs, etc. And it's a heartbreak. I think you sort of spoke how quickly you got into activism, and it was this one teacher. I had a similar. I had a teacher at 11, 12 who was, as I've done sort of emotional healing work as an adult. I realised he was pivotal in keeping me alive, keeping me going in boarding school. Lovely man by the name of Bill, ex-army guy, but very kind, very compassionate, good man. And so sometimes it just takes one, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Melvin Bragg, the British reporter and raconteur, spoke once about how he'd interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands of people over his career. And he was amazed at how many people that have grown up with poverty or, emotional or financial poverty, and said there was this one teacher and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. And he normally interviews people that have really done something special with their lives. And it was very interesting with my teacher. I forgot about her. I was 16. I was in London. I went on with my life. And then 20 years later, I found myself in a mid-career program at Harvard University as part of my work. And a professor was talking about the way that teachers, a minority of teachers, really engage with their children and build a strong, solid connection with them. But often those teachers are the outliers. But when they engage, particularly with kids in trouble, they can change the trajectory of their lives. At that point, I remembered my teacher, all those years later. And so I made a point of finding her. It took us several months, and I found her, and I went back to go and see her in the UK. And, we've remained in touch. And this year I took my son to go and meet her. It's really, and when I met her, I told her that these are the things I've done with my life, and I would never have done them without you. And I think that somebody once said, a good teacher's legacy never ends, because everything that I've done, I'll pass on. And, she really helped me to survive, and I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for her. Her full name is Report, by the way, just to pay tribute to her for a moment.
Well, let's take a breath with her and all those teachers out there who have changed lives, because there will be many of them. And that's beautiful. And so you were very quickly into activism. What were you carrying out into the world from that childhood? What wounds were you carrying, and how did they show up in your life as you became an adult?
I was in survival mode. I'd grown up in survival mode, but I'd always had two things that I think were really important to me. I was very optimistic person somehow. I knew that I was in a bad spot, but things could be better through hard work and all of that. And the second thing is, I think somehow I had a role model when I was young. I was surrounded by people that would go into crime or gangs and all of that. But there's one role model that I really I saw, who was hardworking, who became a very close friend. Who was a hardworking person, just a couple of years older than me, and I wanted to be like that. I wanted to hold my life with integrity. So I think integrity and optimism were two of the good things that I took forward. But I also had survival and suppression. So I was somebody that could think on my feet. I always found in my career that I was very bad at the things where you had to sit down and carefully plan stuff, which is a lot of that in the UN. I'm very bad at it. But thinking on my feet, I was exceptional because I had to survive, especially when I ran away um, from the care system. And then the other thing I think, which maybe is in common with a lot of your listeners, is that I had, but didn't know that I had, very serious child trauma, insecure attachment, toxic stress, all of that, and I had to suppress it because, well, firstly, you have to suppress these things because they're taboo, and you've got issues of shame and stigma. But I had to suppress it as I went on with my career because I was in contexts where yeah, where you had to behave in a very correct way, especially when I got to the UN and all of that. And so I kind of really suppressed, I think, all the things that I've been through and tried to hide them subconsciously from myself and certainly from everybody else.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, it resonates straight across to my life. The hypervigilance and any sort of battleground childhood, whatever was the battle, whether it's state care or boarding school or just a family home that wasn't safe or stable, or coming from very early years stuff. And we'll get on to talk about, the importance of the first 1,000 days in a child's life, those early attachments. And you mentioned that you had an avoidant attachment style, as did I. I carried at 7 years old an avoidant attachment style into boarding school, which is an avoidant environment, and so it gets doubled down on. And I did a podcast yesterday where we were talking about people who come into the boarding school system, young children who maybe have a secure attachment, and seeing the impact of that breaking then suddenly at 7, or they're coming in anxiously attached and trying to cling to peers, that they're other kids around them who are also in a fight, flight, freeze sort of frenzy, and so trying to cling on to those peer attachments which are so fragile at that age. And it really is, any form of that separation or attachment wound is so powerful. So let's just explore a little bit then, around, obviously seen and heard is boarding in independent schools, private school sector. Not always. Sometimes, there are many state boarding schools, behavioural facilities, etc., or special needs boarding schools, which we cover in our not-for-profit. But what do you see as the sort of similarities, differences between perhaps, let's say, a child boarding at 7 or 8 years old or a child going into state care at 7 or 8 years old?
I think in both cases they're in a state of emotional poverty. There's a lot of attention on economic poverty. If you're from care, you're really in an underclass. You're the bottom 1% of the population, and we have these catastrophically bad indicators now, going to prison and life expectancy and homelessness and all of that. Kids in boarding schools often forgotten, and it's very much hidden, have exactly the same level of emotional poverty because they are separate from their parents. It's not a natural situation to be away from your family. Children, there's no species where that is the norm, and that should include human beings. But in both care and in boarding school, you're kind of in a state of emotional neglect. I would say that's the similarity. It's the main similarity to me, and then that carries its way through life in the trauma and the insecure attachment that stays within you as a result of that.
Thank you. Just when you mentioned that bottom 1%, what came to me was, if the bottom 1% are finding their way into state care and the top 1% are finding their way into boarding care, then we've got kind of two ends of society, if you want to call it that way, who are experiencing a lot of this attachment rupture and a lot of wounds. And we know there's been a great film recently called Boarding on Insanity, which explores the wounded leaders that have come through the boarding school system and gone on to wreak havoc in the world, or in particularly politics or business, or there are countless reels of monarchs and business people, etc., who come through the boarding school system who we know are carrying that attachment wound. You talk in your book and in your work about the links with criminality, and so what is, and you mentioned gangs and your friend who was killed in a gang incident. Is it that trap, that sort of poverty trap in the state care system? Does it really over-index in the amount of people that come out go on to commit crimes and end up in the justice system?
I think poverty is a driver of crime for sure. But if you look at the state penitentiary here in New York, or in the UK or in Wales, there's data from Wales on who becomes a chronic repeat offender. It's children with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and that career starts in adolescence. And this is really interesting because in adolescence you have this reorganization of the brain, and this is a moment of profound potential and profound risk. And children with 4 or more ACEs are more likely to have very serious risk. Adolescence is a time of risk. Kids with high ACEs are more likely to take risks. So, you also see things like car accidents in the US or the UK. The worst car accidents normally are much more likely when it's adolescent, and particularly if adolescent has got other peers in the car. We see things like grooming and trafficking and radicalization and likelihood of becoming an addict, all extremely prevalent amongst children with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So children in care are the visible tip of a submerged iceberg, because on average about 15% of any given population in any part of the world have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and less than 1% of children are in care. I think that often with elite families, you see this here in the United States and in the UK, there's other forms of bad behaviour, but often white-collar crimes, other forms of risk and poor outcomes that result from traumatic childhood. This is very visible all around us. So I would say that the major correlation is between adversity and risk for crime, not specifically care.
Thank you. That's really powerful to sort of unpack that a little bit. And as I said, those ACEs can come from anywhere, any kind of background. I remember doing a piece of emotional healing work myself about 3.5 years ago, when I was really learning about, after my breakdown, I was learning about adverse childhood experiences. And I made a joke to my therapist. It was, that's how I got through things, using humor. But I made a joke that I was holding all the ACEs, and we unpacked and went through, and there was, they were all, certainly 4 or 5 were there present. And I look back at my life and the risk taking, my addictions, at times going the wrong side of the law. And I think there is a strong correlation. I mean, there's a study being done at Teesside University, I believe, around boarding schools creating criminal behaviour, being and that there is this link often between the kind of the gangsters and the toffs. And they play pretty well together. There's even the brilliant sort of Guy Ritchie stuff recently, The Gentleman, and the series, and Lock, Stock, and his films. They show the sort of gangsters who come from poverty and the gangsters who come from wealth.
We kind of tend to romanticize the idea of the posh cad, right? I think that the cad is the term they used to use. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's the way that emotional poverty, the absence of a buffer from violence and other forms of trauma in early childhood, because of the absence of parents, is all driving humans towards risk. And now, I've seen, when I was writing the book, I must have looked at hundreds of studies, hundreds of sets of stats from juvenile justice systems, from drug services, from on things like radicalization and all different forms of risk, and the link between ACEs for children from any social background is very, very clear.
Thank you. So just coming back to you and your journey, then you mentioned some of these things you carried out into adulthood, both good that have been positive for you and challenging. How did you come to realize that there was some work that was needed in your life, and what did you do? What did you do to start to heal and start to understand?
It's a great question. So I was at the peak of my career. I had you referred to one of my jobs in the introduction. I had like an ambassadorial rank UN job in a country, and I accompanied a minister to an event on children in care and how on deinstitutionalization. There was a Europe-wide initiative with the Office High Commission for Human Rights of the UN and the EU to deinstitutionalize all children under 3. And we were trying to make that work in the country that I was working in. And I went to a talk, and there was a guy called Professor Kevin Brown from University of Nottingham. You may know him as an expert on attachment and institutional care. And he was talking about the way that kids that grow up feeling unsafe or unloved, particularly in institutions, the way that plays out in their emotional world throughout life. And he was talking about things I'd never heard about, that avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, fearful attachment. And I was sitting there in my suit in full glare of the media, because for events like that, in those situations, it's very formal, lots of media. I was speaking at and opening the event with the minister. And I was sat next to the minister, and I was listening to this, and I began to just crumple inside my suit, because he was talking about me. I mean, he's talking about the kids that we want to deinstitutionalize and to liberate from horrible conditions, but he was also talking about me, and I recognized that. And so I walked out in the coffee break with this kind of epiphany, and I called a friend who'd mentioned that she'd been seeing a therapist. And I asked for the number, and a week later, I was in therapy, and I did it for over a year. I introduced meditation as well, and I began to really, really just explore the kind of stuff. I had a language for it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't really, really hard work. But parts of it were difficult. But overall, I really wanted to transform. I really wanted to change this part of my life, and I'd never thought about it before. And there's so many things that I just thought were normal for everybody, and they weren't. So the psychoanalyst helped to unpack that. I did stuff like I went back to the children's home. I'd always been terrified to go and have a look at it, but I went and stood at the door. It was just a door. I went back to places in my childhood that I'd never been. I thought about things that I'd suppressed, and I just worked through them. And my world, I don't know about you, but my world went from black and white to color. I couldn't imagine that a human being could be that happy, right? Because I began to be much kinder to myself. I think I've been really tough on myself to have a really amazing career, to be, in many ways, try to be an exceptional person, to suppress what I thought was a deficiency in my childhood, to make up for it. So that then got me really passionate about this theme and this idea and this piece of work. It's over 10 years ago. And then maybe just to share this final part of this process, when I had my son in New York here a few years ago, and I held him in my arms, what had happened to me as a child had become unimaginable to myself. I knew that I loved him with all my heart, and that I would walk to the end of the earth to protect him and make him feel safe and secure and seen and soothed and all of that. And then I thought for a moment that I really have healed from these things. I mean, you never completely 100% heal, but I've healed enough to be functional and to know how to protect the emotional world of another human being. And I've developed what's called an earned secure attachment. And then I asked myself with my UNICEF kind of experience of working on huge public health campaigns. If I can heal like this, can we not prevent this kind of trauma before it happens and respond to every child before they reach adolescence and the risk period too? So things like parenting programs and all of that, it's quite in the book. And I think that's the journey for me. And the book is kind of another part of that journey. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, but just to share that with you.
Thank you, Ben. It's a beautiful answer, and it brings up a lot for me. I think I had a breakdown at just after 40, and the corporate climbing that I'd been doing for 20 years, and the alcohol I'd used to keep myself on a level, or all the other addictions: gambling, sex addiction, porn addiction, smoking, that junk food. I'd just been stacking these sort of coping mechanisms up for years, and I finally got to the sort of the top-ish of what I was doing, and I realized I was miserable, and the whole thing just came down because it was built on built on a kind of sand. It was just so flimsy. Thank God, because as you say, the healing process, therapy, as you shared, meditation, same for me. But ultimately starting to be kind to yourself, mindful self-compassion, as they would call it. But because the inner critic that you develop in a battleground childhood, you have to have a strong inner critic to keep you safe.
Yeah.
And so that inner critic then relentlessly drives you in your life for decades until it stops serving you, until a soul part, a deeper part says enough. And your moment was that crumpling in that press conference. Mine was I got COVID and had a really bad experience with COVID, and it put me. I couldn't then leave the house anymore. My anxiety was so bad, etc. So it's remarkable. I love that in the book there is that clear message that you believe that we all have capacity to heal at any age, no matter what from, and that at some point when you've done your own healing work, or I work with others to heal as a coach, emotional health coach, at some point you go, but we've got to swim back upstream to stop there being so many people who need patching up and fixing and healing. So I hear you then linking it back to your work to try and bring that through, stop the ACEs in the first place, or to at least mitigate when they do it, because we are going to lose people in childhood. Parents are going to end up in the criminal justice system, or there is drugs and alcohol around. So it's kind of how early can we bring those trauma informed services into schools, into societies. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to respond to that last point. Our colleague, the UN Special Representative on Violence Against Children, just done an economic review and estimates that at least 11% of GDP is lost through the long-term costs of adverse childhood experiences. So we're talking about not just crime and risk, we're also, very well the link with non-communicable diseases, with poor learning outcomes, with low productivity. And yet the most impactful intervention that we can do for prevention is universal parenting programs that visit home visits, that support families during particularly the early part of life, but also through key milestones throughout childhood. They would cost a fraction of that. And it's very easy now to make them. I think some of the things that were peeled back in the UK in the austerity period, like Sure Start, Home Start, and all of that, are exactly the kind of services that secure a vast return on investment. And I think that in the same way that in the 1980s and 90s, global vaccine coverage went from 20% of the world's children to 80% of the world's children, and reduced child mortality, the number of under fives that die annually, by 61%. There are millions of children alive today and every year who wouldn't be alive without that intervention. I think our generation's responsibility, in the same way that generation harnessed the available science to save children's lives, the responsibility of our generation is harness the available science to ensure that we eradicate to the extent possible, child maltreatment. That's a realistic vision now. I think it's very hard in this moment because there's so much noise with culture wars and, this identitarian kind of political moment. But I think if we wanted to do something amazing as a legacy, it would be to really try to eradicate child maltreatment.
Mm. What an amazing thing to do as a generation, as you say. I think trauma-informed, do you feel that we are becoming more trauma-informed as a society?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to the bookshop in New York or London, where you are, and you look at the non-fiction shelf, half of what's being sold is about parenting, about trauma, about mental health, all of that stuff. People like Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate are now household names. And so Brene Brown. So there is a huge, and also things like the royal family talking about it. Could you imagine 30 years ago or 40 years ago? It just wouldn't be possible. It's footballers, others. So you do have this opening up. What we need to do is have the policy focus to match that. So if we are becoming much more aware of the issue, we need to go to the root causes to prevent it. And I think that's where we could do more work.
Thank you. Yeah, we're involved with Survivors Trust here and their Act on ICSA campaign, so the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, which is now nearly 3 years on from its final report here in the UK, in England. And still none of the 20 recommendations have been fully brought through to protect young people from sexual abuse or to help adults who've survived child sexual abuse to heal. You mentioned policy change. I find it difficult to see this change coming from up top, if you like. It feels like a grassroots movement. You mentioned Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate and others, and their work is now infiltrating into kind of schools and communities and people going to therapy and men's groups. I run a lot of men's groups, etc. But I don't see it from the top. Now you're working at the top with governments, with legislative environment. What needs to happen amongst the people that set legislation to bring this through more?
There was an interview with Jack Shonkoff a few weeks ago. He's a preeminent specialist on early childhood development, and he was talking about how do we convince policymakers to engage in early prevention and early childhood development. And it's really hard because kids don't vote, right? So it's not necessarily politically attractive, but parents do. But he suggested that we need to make it a legacy issue, in the way that I described it, that this is our generation, this is the knowledge we have. The previous generation did vaccines and other stuff, nutrition, other things. This should be our legacy. So I think to frame it like that, to frame the economic costs and benefits, to make parents fundamentally aware of child development, what children need and what they should expect from policymakers. And I think policymakers themselves need to say, we're going to do the 2 or 3 things at the universal level, that means the population-wide level, that we know do the most to prevent and mitigate this issue. So I think 3 things are to focus on primary attachment, so to ensure that society invests in primary attachment by really good conditions of parental leave to give time, very good perinatal care to make sure that to the extent possible the delivery and the pregnancy and the way the family comes together to support the mother through that process is really informed about the need to prevent stress and to be supportive environment. And most importantly, parenting programs, which are these home visits, which WHO, the World Health Organization, and Oxford University just did a meta review with 435 randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard on measuring impact. And they found that these programs have a huge impact on outcomes like neglect, abuse, learning outcomes, and as an unexpected benefit, they also improve the mental health of the parent. So I asked Bruce Perry, why do you think this is? And I asked Nadine Burke-Harris as well, I wrote about it in the book, why do you think this is? And we had conversations, and there were lots of things about, it's really good that parents have like timely support. They think somebody is interested in them and it gives structure and so on. But it's also about love, because if a parent has grown up in an emotionally barren context themselves, and then they're supposed to make to automatically develop the skills to express love to a child, they can't. So if somebody helps to empower them with the skills to play, connect, it'd be amazing how many people can't play, how many adults can't play because they didn't play as kids. You know that with the work that you do. If they learn these skills with the child, with the help of a parenting expert, just a few times in the early part of childhood, this can have an enormous effect on improving their mental health, because when a parent can care for a child, it's reciprocal. Speak to any parent that's a stressful day, the first thing you want to do is go home and hug their children, right? It's reciprocal. That love goes two ways, and it's love that ultimately heals. The parents develop an earned, secure attachment, and that through that relationship with the child, with the help of the home visitor, and that is a win-win for everybody. So that's the primary attachment. The other thing is the secondary attachment, and ensuring that in schools, every child is connected, right? That every child has a healthy connection with an adult that they can talk to, that will take an interest in them, that children are secure, safe, seen, and when needed, they're soothed by the teacher. If the primary attachment is missing, it's the secondary attachment that will help the child to get through and to sever the risk of intergenerational transmission. So all of this needs to be underpinned by addressing myth, stigma, shame, all of the issues that make this a very hard topic for people to talk about in terms of their own families. And we also need much more awareness of child development and what's happening to children at these different stages in life, and how parents can help them to progress.
Thank you. There's so much in there I'd like to come back into, because it just speaks to me so much. But when you mentioned the sort of perinatal, postnatal, etc., just support. I go to my own story of my mum having very bad postnatal depression. Yeah. She was alcoholic. She then became suicidal, and then she left 2 or 3 times before I was 5, just having breakdowns, hospitalizations, etc. And before my parents then put me into boarding school at 7. So I see that in that primary phase, help would have been invaluable for our family. Yeah. And then in the secondary phase, in a boarding school that was effectively a loveless and pretty frightening environment, to save 1 or 2 teachers, again, that secondary phase probably could have helped me, but it wasn't present in that secondary phase either. So what happened in primary got doubled down on in secondary, and then I came out as a mess. So I really honour your approach of making it so clear. So let's take primary and those critical first 1,000 days that you talk about in your book and in your work. You also mentioned Home Start, and that spoke to me. My stepmom was a Home Start worker for years and years and years, until it sort of stopped in her area, in her county. It wasn't funded anymore, or she came out of it. But I saw firsthand how many families she supported who were really struggling. And they're the same families. She works at the food bank now. They're the same families who are using the food bank a lot of the time. So what would you like to see present, as soon as possible for that primary phase, that first 1,000 days? What would you like to see here in the UK or where you are?
Firstly, to acknowledge your own struggle and everything you've just described, and my respect for your effort to to heal from that and address that, and acknowledge that and the impact it had on you.
Thank
I
you.
just want to say something about the first 1,000 days, because this is really important. So in the first 1,000 days, it's the period of profound emotional, social, cognitive, sensory development. None of us can remember what happened to us, at least verbally we can't retrieve what happened to us before the age of 2. None of us can, nobody can. People say they can, they can't. We're not able to verbally retrieve it or to remember it or to imagine it. But it disproportionately impacts the way that we see ourselves, those around us, and the world in general. If the world's a hostile or a safe place, if we are valuable as an individual, of worth as an individual, or if we are worthless, if the people around us can be trusted or not, all of that is shaped in that period that we can't remember. And it doesn't even need to be an intergenerational trauma that can put that at risk. If a mother has postnatal depression, and it's an environment where nobody talks about mental health, and the father doesn't know what's happening, thinks she's being selfish or whatever, and doesn't get involved, and nobody steps in to support the relationship with the child, that's going to there's very likely to be a situation of disassociation and emotional impact on the child at exactly that moment when they're forming the foundations of their emotional, social, and cognitive self. And if those foundations are not set in a way that creates security and safety and foundation for learning as a child, that's going to affect throughout the whole childhood. So early attachment, is probably the greatest economic, social asset that our society has, right? So knowing what we know from that WHO research that I just led meta review that I described, we know that a simple low-cost intervention can massively boost the potential for a healthy attachment in a way that is akin to a vaccine, in the sense that if it's rolled out at the population level, it is likely to have a huge impact on reducing risk for children in early childhood. So I talk in the book a little bit about the situation of a Scottish member of the Scottish Parliament, very prominent member of the Scottish Parliament, who has talked very openly, very bravely about her own experience. She had postnatal depression. She wasn't aware of it. She was like maybe us, career-driven person who expected to always be performing at the highest level, and she had a very difficult pregnancy and a postnatal depression. And it was the presence of the home visitor and the home visitor being plugged into the GP and all of that system they have in Scotland that helped her to recognize it. And then the other parent was able to come in and support and compensate, support and acknowledge the situation that mom was in, but also to ensure that the child was not in that moment in deficit of a secure attachment. Now, then I asked her, what would have happened 30 years ago? And she told me that she'd been listening to a radio phone. She'd been on a radio phoning, and lots of men had called in and said, 30 years ago, I had the same thing, and we had no clue what was going on. So then progress in society would be to make sure that everybody knows what postnatal depression is. Everybody knows where alcoholism comes from and where addiction comes from and the link with ACEs, that everybody would understand these things in the same way they understand COVID. The prevalence of ACEs is similar to the prevalence of COVID. Everybody understands COVID. Minority of people in the public understand ACEs. We can change that, and then that would dramatically improve outcomes.
Oh, so powerful, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, just that likening of how, if you look at what happened with COVID, the interagency approach, the amount of money that was thrown at it, the global connection around vaccines and communication and etc. Whatever you may think of COVID and what happened in the vaccine, you can't deny that it pulled resources to its core, and therefore awareness was very high very quickly. and you're advocating for an approach around ACEs awareness and in early interventions that is similar, and that is our generation's contribution, if you like, our legacy contribution. I'm really hearing that clearly. So then, if that's the first 1,000 days, if that's the primary, then the secondary. So let's just dip into the secondary. So whether it be mainstream schooling or alternative school provision, or it takes a village to raise a child, as they always say. So what we're looking at here is, if the ball does get dropped, and it will in that primary phase, what do you want to see in the secondary phase to further support those who've been affected in the primary phase, or catch the ones who've not had any interventions there? What do you want to see?
I think that in general, education system needs to be reformed. The global education system needs to be reformed. Every child needs to be in preschool, learning through play. Schools need to be, regular schools in many places need to be deindustrialized because they still have a 19th century model of kids sitting in desks facing the front. I think all of this needs to be much more in rhythm with the natural rhythm of child development. And part of that is that children learn from people they love. And children that feel loved at home come to school to learn, but children that don't feel loved at home come to school to be loved. And they express it in the most challenging of ways. So we just need to understand all of that it's just normal child development. So in a school, in a school context, relationships need to be the core. There's a guy, and I'm talking about him in the book, there's a guy called John Hattie, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne, who does the most amazing review of all the research on learning outcomes all the way back to the Second World War, and globally. So he's really a data kind of cruncher, nerd in chief. And he has a league table of things that drive learning outcomes. And the top of that league table is relationships with teachers, the connection with the teacher competence, those kind of things, trust in the teacher. So even if trauma didn't exist, to build a developmentally appropriate education system that will drive the best outcomes, it will be built around relationships. Knowing what we know, that more than half of children are coming to school with some risk factor for trauma, according to global data, then we have a greater imperative to have a healthy approach to relationships in school, for children to be secure and safe and seen and soothed. So how are people doing this? Well, Harvard, for example, has this program that where very simple. In a school, they have a register of all the children, and they put a gold star next to a child they have a healthy relationship with and a good daily communication with. And then they look at the children that have no stars, and they intentionally engage with them and form a relationship with them. In Scotland, in their millennial goals, they have every child having a healthy adult relationship, normally in school. There are so many emerging models. We haven't yet got a meta review on trauma-informed school programs that focus on relationships, but we need to continue to build up the research to understand the different models and have them rolled out. But I feel that approach, which is relational, developmentally appropriate, in the early years centered on play, which is how kids naturally build relationships, I think all of that needs to be introduced. And of course, to be fully aware of trauma. Teachers need to be fully aware of trauma. And I have a diagram of a classroom which shows in the book, that shows the distribution of ACEs within a normal classroom. And I think teachers need to have that in mind. Most do, some don't, but the system needs to intentionally have that as part of teacher training.
Yeah, thank you. This is so powerful. The one that really just came through, everything you said was bang on the money, but that idea that, if a child is coming from a loved home, they come to learn. If they're coming from an unloved home, they come for love. And of course, we still see a lot of this behaviourist approach in education, particularly here in England, um, where it's about exams, it's about league tables, it's about in the boarding and independent school sector, it's then about how much sport, drama, music, and extracurricular can we jam into a child, within a short period of time. Um, um, I see pockets of this relational approach that you speak of, but it's definitely not widespread. There's still here an arms race in schools to where more is more, to just put more and more stuff, cram more and more into the child, as opposed to slowing things down. Less is more unstructured play that you talked about, more relational time and focus. So yeah, I think Scotland are in Britain. Scotland are ahead because of the commitments they've made at a governmental level. I did a podcast with the real David Cameron the other day, who's a brilliant educationalist from Scotland who has a great deal of experience in trauma-informed schools and with the ACEs community. And then you've got Dr. James Manning, who's worked on the approach in Wales, on a more well-being welfare approach that's sort of rolling out into Wales. England feels behind, and in boarding and independent schools, that feels behind the state sector for this relational area. I still think there's a burnout culture and there's an arms race going on between schools. Can you speak to that from your?
Well, I both live and parent elsewhere, and I'm not really fully engaged with I deal with 195 countries in my work. I don't really deal too much with the UK, although obviously I'm a senior fellow at the Department of Education in University of Birmingham, and I engage to some extent. I know there's this sense of overdoing it with things like ratings and with content and missing the thing about how do you help a child to love to learn. The jobs the job that our kids are going to be doing hasn't been invented yet, right? So the kids are going to have to learn to love to learn throughout the whole of their life, because they're going to have to reskill. So when we make it so difficult, when there's so many good ideas around Finland and other places have fantastic ideas on learning and making schools much more in tune with the rhythm of children, I think we have a problem in England. I see it quite a lot. It goes all the way back to Dickens, right? We have this kind of tough approach to childhood that I think it's important that kids grow with. It doesn't build resilience in kids. It's a misunderstanding of childhood often that drives this kind of fierce behavioralism and performative approach to learning. And I don't know enough about it on a day-to-day basis to comment with confidence, but I certainly I acknowledge the points that you're making. I think a lot needs to change. Yeah.
Thank you. So, given you've got the global view that I haven't got, you mentioned Finland. Who's getting this right? Who's ahead on this? Who should we be looking at?
I don't think any country is getting all of it right. Sweden banned corporal punishment in 1979, right? And they did it in a very clever way. It was the first country to ban it. And they had this thing where they had messages about why it doesn't work developmentally on milk cartons. So the day after the law was enacted, parents would sit around the table with them, have breakfast with their kids, and they'd read about it and discuss it. And it's just like a really well thought out campaign. 79, that's 46 years ago, right? That's there are now 50 or 60 countries that have outlawed corporal punishment. England still hasn't. That's also illustrates the point about this harshness that we have, Dickensian harshness approach that we have sometimes to our kids. But I don't think any country's got all of it really right, but some are prioritizing it more. And I think Finland, some of the Scandinavian countries are really, really good examples. Estonia is a really interesting example because it emerged from the Soviet Union. We do a league table. UNICEF does a league table each year of high income countries' performance in terms of early childhood, so access to preschool, parental leave, quality, affordable childcare, all of those things. And Estonia now comes on top, and Slovenia, also a former socialist country. Both these countries now are very much free market, but they're leading the way in terms of child development. So they're really good examples. Countries like Mexico, South Africa are trying, in the global south, are trying to roll out scaled up parenting programs. Australia has a lot of focus on the way it works on primary prevention now, but there's no standout country that is doing exceptionally well. In New York, where I live, in the state of New York, not just the city, but the whole state, we know that around 60% of people have got one adverse child experience, but less than 5% of parents receive a parenting program. Now, this is really interesting because parenting programs are primarily, evidence-based parenting programs are primarily designed and studied in the US, a place like Harvard and Yale and Stanford. And then that technology goes all around the world. It's implemented very poorly here in the US. The United States is a country, the only country in the world, I think, apart from one other, that has no, the only high-income country that has no nationwide paid parental leave. So I think that, we've got a lot of work to do everywhere, but we have some promising countries that are trying to do their best.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ben, for that sort of global view. What really spoke to me was when you mentioned Dickensian. If you think about it, certainly the education system here, state and private, but very much the boarding school system was designed to, keep that model going. The model of empire. There was no real need for a relational approach in building good soldiers of empire to send out into the colonies in the world. It was better to break the child early, to remake them in a sort of Spartan philosophy, so that they could go to these outposts in India or Canada or the US or South Africa or wherever, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Take this business model out there educationally, very behaviourist approach, very strict, very all lined up, classic education, because it was a great way of controlling the locals, controlling the indigenous populations as part of the empire. And I think, you speak about America, there's a lot of hangover in the States from the kind of the founding fathers, if you like, from the trauma that was brought from Europe and some of these cultures. And we see it all around the world, Canadian boarding schools for the indigenous population, and the shameful trauma that was inflicted on people there and all over the world where these sort of pockets of empire have sprung up. So, without getting too political about it, I do hear that there is a lot of work to undo some of what Britain exported and some of the European superpowers exported.
Yeah, I write a chapter in the book about communal collective trauma, and I look at the Holocaust, slavery, and also the boarding school thing with the Native Americans. And I think that we still today live in a world where there is catastrophic cruelty to children. You see the rolling back of humanitarian law and norms by some countries in the world who are waging wars and not abiding by the things that had become normal protective mechanisms for children and civilians in those situations. That's a major worry. Like, are we going backwards as a society when really we should, as a world, we should be really going forward? I think I just want to come back on one point that all of us forget, and you alluded to it a little bit. For most of human history, and I think Steven Pinker writes about this brilliantly, for most of human history, children in many parts of the world, children were seen as, you had to beat the devil out of them, and you had to tame them. We were terrified. Parents were terrified of war and famine and disease, and the world was a very much more dangerous place. And so, in our evolutionary biology, we have the period in which we've had a progressive approach to childhood is like a blip in a vast spectrum. It was in the Enlightenment that people started to talk about children as people that I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others talked about children as people that you could nurture to become good citizens and to flourish and to live happy lives. That's relatively new in our history. So we have to be, in the same way that you and I individually have to be less hard on ourselves as people that have survived trauma and to learn to be less hard on ourselves, we also have to acknowledge how far we've come as a world and how we are in a positive process of evolution towards giving, children born today in many parts of the world are just much better off than all of their ancestors through the entire history of their own people, right? They're much better off. So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, and that should make us ask the question: how do we contribute to this for the next generation? Lots of terrible things in the world, also reason for optimism, and that should be a foundational platform for us to do our bit in helping our species along.
Beautiful, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what came to me there, I'm feeling some stuff coming up, and I think for me, I believe very much in the concept of the fall, which, if you like, was 200,000 years of human existence. Around 7 to 8,000 years ago, we started to practice totalitarian agriculture and move away from a hunter-gatherer sort of state that had served us for 190,000 years before that. So for me, actually, what's happening now, and I believe in this upswing, I believe there is a move away from further away from patriarchy into the age of Aquarius, a more relational, feminine approach. And this upswing, I'm seeing it in society, and I'm a part. I want to be a part of moving it along. But I believe actually we were okay, and then we weren't for the last 6,000 or 7,000 years, and now we're just finding ourselves again. If you look at what's helping us to heal, sharing circles, connection with nature and the earth, this idea of oneness or consciousness. These were all sort of animistic practices that existed for us for 195,000 years until they didn't. And so for me, it's a homecoming for humanity. But as before we finish, because time is upon us, the book itself, we've talked into a lot of the themes that are baked within the book, and it's an incredible piece of work you've created, Ben. So I really honour you for that. Is there anything from the book that you want people to take away from this podcast today? Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to bring in?
I think that, I have touched upon it, but I just want to leave a parting message that, we're the first. Child trauma is the biggest social and public health problem that we have. Addressing it is an accelerator for so many social and public health problems. It costs a fraction of what we lose by not addressing it to put in place the things we need to prevent and address child trauma. But most importantly, we're the first generation in history that have the knowledge and ability to be able to address it. And I would like anybody listening to this to be a champion. I'm sure they already are, to be a champion for a really sharp focus on universal access to parenting programs, parental leave, good perinatal care, trauma-informed schools, and breaking the myth and shame and stigma around the issue. And finally, that, we can heal at any age. And when we do, it can be hard work, really hard work, especially for some people. But when we do, there's nothing quite like it. And how it's a power world.
What a beautiful way to bring things to close, Ben. That's an excellent summary. So thank you so much for your work, for the book, for what you're doing and what you've done in your career, but also just for your sharing. That I love this. What's really staying with me, this idea of kind of that earned attachment in later life. I've for me, I attached to myself at age 41, and then therefore I was able to attach with my children before they were too old, and with a partner, etc. We spent a long time in recent years in civilization striving for independence, and actually it's a move to interdependence that we need to look at our connections. So let's finish that for today. The book that we've been speaking about is out there at the moment, which is Trauma Proof: Healing, Attachment, Science and Prevention by Benjamin Pack. So that will be in the show notes, as well as some links to Ben's work. And yeah, we'll just say a big thank you to you today, Ben. Thank you for your time and for your energy in this. It really is the most important thing our generation can do. And to thank everybody listening. Please share this podcast with others. It's important work Ben's doing. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. So goodbye, Ben, and goodbye, everybody else.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.